Funny how the loudest voice in the room is usually the one that heard the least. The clink of silverware blended into soft jazz as Emily Carter moved between tables with quiet precision, her black apron tied neatly at her waist, her posture calm, unhurried, almost invisible to those who never bothered to look twice. Table 14 sat near the center of the dining room, beneath a warm chandelier that cast a golden glow over polished glass and white linen. And at that table sat Richard Cole, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines, a billionaire so known for turning silence into obedience and conversations into commands, his tailored suit sharp, his watch catching the light every time he checked the time, as if even seconds answered to him. He didn't look up when Emily approached, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond a slight flick of his fingers, as if summoning rather than speaking, and when he ordered, his voice was smooth but distant, words delivered quickly, already moving on before they fully landed. Emily listened, really listened, repeating the order back with quiet clarity, each item precise, her voice steady. But Richard had already returned to his phone, his attention elsewhere, his world moving too fast for something as small as confirmation. Around them, conversations continued, low and comfortable, the kind of environment where everything was designed to feel effortless, but effort was exactly what Emily gave, table after table, step after step, 8 hours into her shift, and still moving with the same measured grace, her eyes noticing details others missed, her mind tracking every request, every nuance, every tone. In the kitchen, plates were assembled with care, timing calculated down to the second, and when Emily returned with Richard's order, everything was exactly as spoken, exactly as confirmed, every detail aligned with what had been said, not what had been assumed. She set the plate down gently, a practiced motion, a quiet offering, and for a moment, nothing seemed out of place until the silence broke, not softly, not gradually, but all at once, as Richard's chair shifted back with a sharp scrape against the floor, his voice cutting through the room like a sudden change in weather. "This isn't what I ordered," he said, loud enough to pull attention from every corner, loud enough to turn heads and pause forks midair. The music kept playing, but it felt distant now, like something happening in another room, as eyes moved toward table 14, drawn not just by volume, but by authority, by the unspoken understanding that when someone like Richard Cole spoke, people listened. Emily stood still, not frozen, not startled, just present, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression composed, her breathing steady, while around her, tension began to build in subtle ways. A manager glancing over, another server slowing their steps, the air itself shifting as if waiting for something to happen. Richard's gaze finally lifted from the plate to her face, sharp, assessing, expecting an apology before one was even spoken, because that was how his world worked, because that was what people did, but Emily didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't lower her eyes, didn't shrink into the moment the way others might have. She simply looked at him, not challenging, not submissive, just clear, just steady, as if the noise around them had nothing to do with her at all. And in that small, almost invisible pause, something subtle began to change, something no one could quite name yet, but everyone could feel, like the moment before a storm decides whether to pass or to stay. The silence did not break right away. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if even the air was deciding which side it belonged to. And Richard Cole leaned slightly forward, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, his voice lower now, but no less sharp. "I do not repeat myself," he said, each word measured, controlled, the kind of tone that usually ended conversations before they began, and somewhere near the bar, a glass paused halfway to someone's lips, forgotten. Emily did not move. Not yet, her eyes flickering briefly to the plate, then back to him, not defensive, not uncertain, just precise, as if she was checking something no one else could see. And a few steps away, the floor manager, Daniel, had already started walking toward them, his smile rehearsed, his apology ready, because situations like this followed a pattern, and he knew his role in it. "Sir, I am so sorry. We can fix that immediately," Daniel began, his voice soft, practiced, but Richard did not look at him, his attention fixed entirely on Emily, because in his world, the person responsible was the one standing in front of him, not the system behind her, not the process, not the noise, just her. "What did I say?" he asked, not as a question, but as a test, a challenge dressed in calm. And Emily felt the weight of the room settle, every expectation quietly pushing her toward the same outcome, the same script: apologize, correct, disappear. She could feel Daniel's presence beside her now, the subtle pressure in his stance, the silent instruction to resolve it quickly, to keep the peace, to protect the restaurant. But Emily did not rush, did not fill the space with hurried words. Instead, she reached slowly for the small order pad tucked at her side, her movements unhurried, deliberate, the paper worn from use but neat, organized, every line clear. She glanced at it for only a second, not because she needed to read it, but because she understood what came next. And when she spoke, her voice was not louder, not sharper, just steady enough to be heard without asking for attention. "You ordered the ribeye, medium rare, no butter, with a side of roasted asparagus," she said, each detail placed carefully, not to argue, but to clarify. And for a brief moment, something shifted across Richard's face, not doubt exactly, but interruption, like a thought that had not been invited. "That is not what I said," he replied, quicker this time, the certainty returning, reinforced by habit, by years of being right simply because no one corrected him, and a few heads nodded faintly around the room, not because they knew the truth, but because they recognized the pattern, the power of confidence over detail. Emily did not respond. Immediately, she let the words settle, let the room breathe, and then, with the same calm precision, she turned the order pad slightly, just enough for him to see, her finger resting lightly beneath the written line, not tapping, not accusing, just indicating, as if inviting him to look rather than forcing him to admit. And Daniel's apology hovered unfinished in the air, caught between intervention and hesitation. Richard's eyes dropped to the page, only for a second, but long enough for the smallest crack to appear, because the words were there, exactly as she had spoken them, clear, undeniable. And yet the silence that followed was not relief, it was tension, because being shown was different from being told, and for a man like him, the difference mattered. He straightened slightly, his jaw tightening, not in anger, but in something quieter, something less familiar. And around them, the restaurant held its breath again, not waiting for a correction, but for a reaction, for what he would do next now that the script had shifted, now that the expected apology had not come. And Emily, still standing, still composed, did not press further, did not claim anything. She simply waited, not for permission, not for approval, but for truth to catch up with pride. The room did not return to normal. It held its shape around that moment, like something fragile that could not be undone. And Richard Cole lifted his gaze from the order pad back to Emily, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he needed a second longer than usual to reassemble the version of himself that never hesitated. But something was different now, not visible to everyone, not loud, just a slight delay between thought and response that had not been there before. He leaned back in his chair, the movement controlled, measured, his hand brushing the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something familiar. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer, not kinder, just less certain of its usual effect. "Anyone can write something down," he said, attempting to regain control of the narrative, to shift the focus back to doubt, because doubt was safer than being wrong. And across the room, a few people exchanged glances, subtle, quiet, sensing the shift but unsure how far it would go. Emily did not react to the deflection, did not argue the logic. She simply reached for the small earpiece tucked discreetly behind her ear, the one connected to the kitchen system, and pressed it lightly, her voice calm as she spoke. "Can you confirm the order for table 14? She said, not to prove him wrong, not to win, but to complete the loop, to let the system speak where she did not need to. And a faint voice answered back through the speaker, clear enough for those nearby to hear, repeating the exact order, every detail aligned, every word matching what was written, what was said, what was delivered. The confirmation hung in the air, undeniable now, not from her, not from him, but from something neutral, something beyond ego. And for a moment, there was nowhere for the tension to go, nowhere to redirect it, nowhere to hide it. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and stays longer than expected, and his eyes flicked briefly around the room, not searching for approval, but noticing something he rarely had to notice. People watching him not with admiration, not with deference, but with something closer to curiosity, even expectation, as if waiting to see whether he would remain who he had always been or become something else. Even for a second, Daniel shifted beside Emily, uncertain now, his rehearsed apology no longer fitting the moment, his role unclear, because this was no longer about fixing a mistake. It was about what came after truth had already been placed on the table. Emily released the earpiece and let her hand fall back to her side, her posture unchanged, her expression still composed, not triumphant, not defensive, just present, as if the outcome did not belong to her, as if she had only done what was necessary and nothing more. The music continued somewhere in the background, soft, steady, but it no longer filled the space the same way, because something else had taken its place, something quieter but heavier. A pause that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, just long enough to demand a response. Richard inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, intentional, and for the first time since he had raised his voice, he did not speak immediately, did not fill the silence with authority, did not push it aside. He sat in it, just for a second, maybe two, long enough for the room to feel it, long enough for the balance to shift in a way that could not be unseen, and Emily, still standing across from him, did not look away, did not press forward. She simply held her place, steady, quiet, as if she understood something most people did not, that sometimes the loudest moment is not when someone speaks, but when they finally stop. The silence did not belong to him anymore. It lingered in the space between them, no longer controlled, no longer directed, and Richard Cole felt it in a way he had not expected, not as resistance, but as reflection, like a mirror he had not chosen to look into. And his fingers, once steady on the table, shifted slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough to break the rhythm he was used to, the rhythm of command, response, resolution. He glanced once more at the plate, untouched, then at the order pad still resting in Emily's hand, then finally back at her face. And this time, he did not search for error. He searched for something else, something harder to define, because certainty had already slipped away. Daniel cleared his throat softly beside them, attempting to step back into the moment. "We can bring you a fresh plate, sir, or anything else you would prefer," he said, careful, neutral, offering an exit that preserved dignity, because that was what people usually wanted. A way out without acknowledgement, a quiet reset. Richard did not respond immediately, his eyes still on Emily, and in that pause, something subtle shifted again, not in the room, but in him, a realization not yet formed into words, but present enough to slow him down. Emily did not fill the silence, did not accept the offered escape on his behalf. She simply stood there, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she was not waiting for a decision, but allowing one to arrive on its own. A couple at a nearby table leaned slightly closer to each other, whispering under their breath, not out of gossip, but curiosity, because the usual pattern had already broken, and what came next was no longer predictable. Richard exhaled quietly, the breath controlled, but heavier than before, and for the first time that evening, he looked down, not at his phone, not at his watch, but at the table itself, at the simple arrangement of utensils and linen that suddenly felt less like a stage and more like something real, something not responding to him. "No," he said finally, the word low, measured, not dismissive, but deliberate, and Daniel paused, unsure whether that meant refusal or acceptance, unsure which direction the moment would take. Richard's hand moved toward the plate, then stopped, as if reconsidering even that small action, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, but clearer, stripped of the performance that had defined his earlier words. "It is correct," he said, each word placed carefully, not to convince others, but to settle something within himself, and the room seemed to exhale with him. A collective release, so quiet it almost went unnoticed. Daniel nodded quickly, relief crossing his face. Before he stepped back, the situation resolved in a way he had not expected, and the surrounding tables slowly returned to their conversations, though the tone had shifted, softer now, more aware. Emily gave a small nod, not as acknowledgement of victory, but of completion, as if a task had simply been finished, and she turned slightly, preparing to step away, her movements as calm as they had been before any of this began. But before she could leave, Richard spoke again, not loudly, not to command attention, but just enough for her to hear. "Wait," he said, and the word did not carry authority this time. It carried something unfamiliar, something closer to intention, and Emily paused, turning back just enough to face him again, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, as if whatever came next would be met the same way, without resistance, without fear, just truth. Emily did not move right away, not out of hesitation, but because the tone of that single word had changed everything. It was no longer a command, no longer an expectation. It was a request, quiet and unfamiliar, and she turned back fully this time, her posture still composed, her expression unchanged, but her attention now focused entirely on him, as if giving him the same space he had unknowingly taken from her before. Richard Cole met her gaze, not with the sharp certainty he had carried earlier, but with something more measured, something slower, as if each word now required consideration instead of assumption, and for a brief second, he seemed almost out of place in his own seat, like a man who had stepped into a room where the rules were different, where volume did not equal authority and presence was not something that could be forced. He glanced once at the table, then back at her, and when he spoke, his voice remained controlled, but the edge was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate. "You repeated the order," he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating, as if retracing steps that had already happened, trying to understand where the shift had occurred. Emily gave a small nod, not defensive, not eager, simply acknowledging. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone even, respectful, without submission, and that balance, that subtle difference, seemed to settle deeper into the space between them. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for just a moment before returning to her, and this time, there was no search for fault, no expectation of correction, only a pause, long enough to feel intentional, long enough for the room to sense that something was being reconsidered. A faint murmur of conversation resumed around them, but it remained distant, like background noise that no longer defined the moment, because at table 14, something quieter was still unfolding. "Then I did not hear it," he said finally, the words measured, careful, not quite an apology, but not far from one either, and the honesty in that admission, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it did not push blame outward, it turned it inward, even if only slightly. Emily did not react with surprise, did not seize the moment. She simply held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded again. A small, almost imperceptible gesture that acknowledged the truth without amplifying it, as if understanding that sometimes recognition did not need to be announced to matter. Richard's hand moved toward the utensils, adjusting them slightly, a quiet, almost unconscious motion, and for the first time since the interaction began, he reached for the meal in front of him, not as a test, not as a statement, but as a continuation, as if accepting what had already been settled. Daniel, still standing a few steps away, allowed himself a subtle breath of relief before stepping back completely, leaving the space to return to its natural rhythm, though something about it remained altered, softer, more aware. Emily shifted her weight slightly, preparing to step away once more, but before she could, Richard spoke again, his voice still calm, still measured. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question did not carry authority, it carried curiosity, genuine and unguarded, the kind that does not demand an answer but invites one. Emily paused, just for a second, then answered, her voice steady as always. "Emily," she said, and for a brief moment, the name seemed to linger longer than expected, not because it was unusual, but because it had not been overlooked this time. And as she turned to continue her shift, moving with the same quiet precision as before, Richard remained seated, watching not in scrutiny, not in judgment, but in something closer to recognition, as if for the first time that evening, he had not just seen the service, but the person behind it. The rhythm of the restaurant slowly returned, but not completely. Something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, like a note slightly out of tune that only a few could hear, and Richard Cole sat there longer than he usually would, his attention no longer divided between messages and meetings, but anchored to something far less efficient and far more unfamiliar. He cut into the steak with measured precision, the knife gliding cleanly, and for a moment, it was just a meal again, just another table, just another evening. But the silence inside him did not match the noise around him. It stayed steady, insistent, as if asking a question he had not yet answered. Across the room, Emily moved from table to table, her pace unchanged, her focus steady, refilling glasses, clearing plates, listening more than speaking, the same quiet presence that had existed before, during, and now after the moment that had briefly centered the entire room around her. And yet nothing in her movement suggested that anything had happened at all. Richard watched her once, then looked away, then found himself looking again, not out of curiosity alone, but because something about the consistency unsettled him. The way she had not adjusted, had not reacted, had not taken advantage of. The shift, as if the moment had not been about winning anything, only about stating something that needed to be said. A server passed by his table, offering a polite check-in, and Richard responded with a simple nod, no longer dismissive, but not performative either, just present, and the difference, though small, was real. He reached for his water glass, paused halfway, then set it back down without drinking, his mind moving through something slower than numbers, slower than decisions, something without clear outcomes or immediate returns. And for a man who built his life on control, that lack of clarity felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. At the service station, Daniel spoke quietly with another staff member, his voice low, but his eyes occasionally drifting toward table 14, not with concern anymore, but with a kind of cautious respect, as if recalibrating his understanding of both the guest and the employee involved, because what had unfolded did not fit neatly into policy or protocol. It existed somewhere in between. Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze following Emily again as she paused beside a table with an elderly couple, her posture softening just enough to meet their pace, her voice quieter, warmer, and the couple responded with easy smiles, their conversation light, unguarded, the kind of exchange that did not require status or recognition to feel complete. And something about that simplicity stayed with him longer than he expected. He glanced at his watch, the polished face reflecting the overhead light. But for the first time that evening, he did not check the time, he only looked, as if the object itself had lost its usual urgency. His phone rested untouched beside the plate, screen dark, silent, a rare stillness that mirrored the one settling in his thoughts. A memory surfaced, not dramatic, not clear, just a pattern, moments like earlier that he had never paused to examine. Conversations cut short, voices overlooked, details missed not because they were absent, but because he had not made space for them. And the realization did not arrive with force. It arrived quietly, like something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. He picked up his fork again, taking another bite, slower this time, tasting it without distraction, and the act itself felt different, not because the food had changed, but because he had. Across the room, Emily turned slightly, her path bringing her closer again, not intentionally, just part of the natural flow of her shift, and as she approached within a few steps of his table, Richard did not look away this time. He held his gaze steady, not demanding, not searching, just acknowledging, as if preparing for something he could not yet fully name, something that no longer required volume to be heard. Emily stepped closer to table 14 with the same measured pace, her attention balanced between presence and movement, and as she reached the edge of the table, she paused just enough to acknowledge him without interrupting. A subtle rhythm she had perfected over years, knowing exactly when to step in and when to let silence speak. Richard did not look away this time, his gaze steady, not searching for error, not asserting control, just aware, and the difference, though quiet, was unmistakable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them no longer tense, no longer expectant, just open, as if the conversation had already begun without words. Emily glanced briefly at the plate, noting what remained, then back at him, her voice soft but clear. "Is everything to your liking?" she asked, The question simple, routine, yet carrying a different weight now, not because of what it asked, but because of what had already been answered. Richard nodded once, a small movement, but deliberate. Yes, he said, and the word did not feel automatic. It felt considered, as if he had taken the time to mean it. Emily gave a slight nod in return, preparing to move on, but something in the moment held just long enough for him to speak again, not quickly, not out of impulse, but with intention that had not been there before. "Emily," he said, her name no longer unfamiliar on his tongue, and she paused again, turning just enough to face him fully, her posture still calm, her expression unchanged, yet attentive. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but because the next words required something different from him, something he did not often offer, not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not in places where being right mattered more than being aware. "You were right," he said finally, the sentence simple, direct, without embellishment, and yet it settled into the air with a quiet weight that carried further than any raised voice could have. There was no audience reaction this time, no collective pause, only the subtle shift of a truth acknowledged without performance. And Emily did not react with surprise or satisfaction. She simply held his gaze for a brief second, then nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that accepted the statement without expanding it, as if understanding that the value was in the saying, not in the response. Richard's hand rested lightly on the table, his fingers still now, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience. And for a moment, he seemed less like the man who had entered the restaurant and more like someone observing himself from a distance, recalibrating something internal that did not show on the surface but could be felt in the quietness of his presence. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her attention already moving to the next table, the next task, because the moment, for her, had already reached its natural end, not extended, not held onto, just completed. "If you need anything else, I will be right over there," she said, her tone steady, professional, but not distant, and she gestured lightly toward the section she was covering, then turned to continue her work, her steps as even and unhurried as before. Richard watched her go for a second longer than necessary, not because he expected more, but because something about the absence of expectation itself was new, unfamiliar, and strangely grounding. He glanced down at the table once more, then reached for his glass, this time taking a slow sip, his attention fully present in the moment, not divided, not rushing ahead. And as the evening continued around him, with conversations rising and falling, with plates arriving and departing, with the quiet rhythm of service unfolding as it always had, something within him remained different, not dramatic, not visible, just shifted, like a single-degree change that would alter everything over time, unnoticed by most, but undeniable to the one who felt it. The evening continued, but for Richard Cole, it no longer felt like a sequence of transactions measured in minutes and margins. It felt slower, almost unfamiliar, as if time had stretched just enough for him to notice things he had trained himself to ignore. The way the lighting softened toward the edges of the room, the quiet coordination between staff members who spoke more with glances than words, the subtle rhythm that existed beneath the surface of what most would simply call service. He set his fork down after finishing the last bite, not abruptly, not absent-mindedly, but with intention, as if even that small action deserved attention now. And for a moment, he remained still, not reaching for his phone, not signaling for the check, just sitting in the quiet space he had once filled with noise. Across the room, Emily moved with the same steady pace, her focus shifting seamlessly from one table to another, her presence consistent, unaffected by recognition or acknowledgement, and that consistency, more than anything else, stayed with him, because it meant that what had happened earlier had not been a performance, not a moment she would carry differently. It had simply been truth expressed at the right time. Richard reached into his jacket, pulling out a small leather card holder, the motion smooth, habitual, but when he placed the card on the table, he did not slide it forward immediately. He let it rest there, his fingers still touching its edge, as if the act of paying no longer felt like the conclusion it once did. Daniel approached quietly, his posture respectful. "Whenever you are ready, sir," he said, his voice careful but no longer tense, and Richard nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, before glancing down at the receipt folder that had been placed in front of him. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the total without urgency, without the quick dismissal of someone for whom numbers had long lost their weight. And then, almost without thinking, he picked up the pen, but instead of signing immediately, he paused, the tip hovering just above the paper, as if considering something beyond the signature itself. His gaze lifted, moving across the room until it found Emily again, now speaking softly with another guest, her attention fully present, her posture slightly inclined forward in a way that signaled listening rather than waiting, and for a second, he watched, not intruding, not expecting anything in return, just observing. He looked back down at the receipt, and this time, when he wrote, the movement was slower, more deliberate, the numbers placed carefully, not as a gesture of display, not as a statement to be noticed, but as something quieter, something that did not need to be explained. He closed the folder gently, his hand resting on it for a brief moment before sliding it toward the edge of the table, signaling completion without urgency. As he stood, adjusting his jacket with the same practiced motion, there was no rush to leave, no immediate return to the pace that had defined his life outside these walls. Instead, he paused, just long enough to take one more look around, not at the room as a whole, but at the details within it, the ones that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Emily turned slightly at that moment, her path aligning with his as she moved toward the service station, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, not by design, not as part of an exchange, just a moment that happened naturally, and Richard gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, just genuine, the kind that carried no expectation of acknowledgement. Emily returned it with the same quiet simplicity, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and then they both moved on, each continuing in their own direction, the moment complete without needing anything more. As Richard walked toward the exit, the door opening to the cool evening air beyond, something followed him out, not a memory in the usual sense, not a lesson fully formed, but a shift, subtle and lasting, the kind that does not announce itself, but changes the way everything is seen from that point forward, quiet, steady, undeniable. The night air outside carried a quiet chill, the kind that made people slow down for just a second before moving on, and Richard Cole stood there a moment longer than necessary after stepping out, his hand still resting lightly on the door as it closed behind him, the muted sounds of the restaurant fading into the background, replaced by the distant hum of the city, steady and indifferent. His driver had already pulled the car up to the curb, the engine idling smoothly, a familiar routine, waiting to resume. But Richard did not move right away, not because he was uncertain where to go, but because something in him had not yet caught up with the pace he had lived by for years. Inside, the restaurant continued as it always did, plates moving, conversations flowing, and Emily returned to table 14 once more, not expecting anything, not searching for anything, just completing the quiet cycle of her work. And when she reached the table, she paused briefly, noticing the receipt folder resting neatly at the edge, exactly where he had left it. No sign of urgency, no sign of display, just placed. She picked it up with the same calm motion she used for everything else, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, and as she opened it, her eyes moved across the paper, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to register what was there. The signature clear, deliberate, and beneath it, a tip that stood out not for its size alone, but for the way it had been written, precise, intentional, without flourish. But it was not the number that made her pause, not the extra zero that would catch anyone's attention. It was the small line just below it, written in the same careful hand, a sentence simple enough to be overlooked, yet impossible to ignore once seen. I will listen next time. It read, nothing more, no explanation, no justification, just a statement, quiet and complete. Emily held the folder for a second longer, her gaze resting on the words, not with surprise, not with satisfaction, but with something softer, something that did not need to be named, and then she closed it gently, her hand smoothing the cover as if returning it to its place in the rhythm of the evening. Across the room, Daniel noticed the brief pause, his curiosity subtle but present, and as Emily passed by him, She handed over the folder without comment, her focus already shifting to the next table, the next guest, the next moment that required her attention, and Daniel glanced inside, his eyes widening slightly before he looked back up. But by then, Emily had already moved on, her presence blending back into the quiet flow of the room as if nothing had happened at all. Outside, Richard finally stepped forward, opening the car door and sliding into the seat, the interior familiar, controlled, the world he understood waiting to receive him again. And as the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights reflected faintly in the window beside him, shifting with every passing block, patterns forming and dissolving without asking for notice. He leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused for a moment, not on the streets ahead, not on the notifications waiting on his phone, but somewhere in between, where the noise of his life had not yet returned to full volume. And in that space, the evening replayed not as a sequence of events, but as a single point of stillness, a moment where something had been revealed without force, without argument, without need for anything more. His hand moved instinctively toward his phone, then stopped, resting instead on his knee, the habit interrupted not by decision, but by awareness. And for a brief second, he allowed the silence to remain